vessel seizures, naval strikes, and the Venezuelan oil crackdown. Today on Breaking Down the Cartels, we confront a critical escalation in the maritime dimension of U.S. policy toward Venezuela and regional criminal networks. In early December 2025, U.S. forces boarded and seized a large oil tanker off the coast of Venezuela. A sanctioned vessel reportedly transporting crude linked to Iranian and Venezuelan networks. This incident is shaping geopolitical tension, oil markets, and the legal boundaries of maritime enforcement. In this episode, we will explain what actually happened, how vessel boarding and seizure differs fundamentally from blowing boats out of the water, both legally and tactically, and then assess what will likely be done with the seized oil and ship. The vessel seizure. What happened? On December 10, 2025, the United States executed a maritime operation to board and seize an oil tanker named Skipper off the Caribbean coast near Venezuela. According to multiple reports, the U.S. Coast Guard, FBI, Homeland Security investigations, and supporting Navy and Marine units launched the operation from the aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. Ford and employed 2 helicopters to fast-rope boarding teams onto the vessel. The ship had reportedly just left Puerto Jose in Venezuela, carrying an estimated 1.8 million barrels of Venezuelan heavy crude. Sanctioned under existing U.S. Treasury restrictions for its role in illicit transport networks, allegedly benefiting Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps interests and designated terrorist organizations. This action represented the first formal U.S. seizure of a Venezuelan oil cargo under sanctions in the current campaign, and it occurred just before a judicial seizure warrant was set to expire. The crews on board did not resist, and there were no reported casualties. The vessel is now subject to a legal forfeiture process in U.S. courts and will be taken to a U.S. port as part of ongoing investigations into sanctions enforcement. In response, the Venezuelan government condemned the action as international piracy and blatant theft of national resources, and allied states such as Cuba have echoed that accusation, framing the seizure as a violation of international law and a threat to regional energy security. The legal framework: seizure versus destruction. To understand why this matter demands such scrutiny, we need to distinguish vessel boarding/seizure from blowing a vessel out of the water, both operationally and legally. Legal basis for boarding and seizure. In U.S. domestic law, particularly in the context of sanctions enforcement, authorities can seize assets, including vessels and cargoes, that are deemed to be used in illegal activities, such as sanction evasion or support for designated terrorist entities. A federal judge issued a warrant under statutes targeting federal crimes related to terrorism and illicit financial support, giving explicit legal authority for the action. Under U.S. maritime law, agencies like the U.S. Coast Guard have broad authority to board vessels, especially when executing a valid warrant. Domestic statutes often govern such actions, and the Fourth Amendment protections are interpreted differently in the maritime context than on land, traditionally allowing boardings and searches by customs and law enforcement without the same warrant requirements applicable to homes. However, in international law, boarding and seizing a foreign-flagged vessel on the high seas without flag state consent is tightly constrained. Treaties such as the 1958 Convention on the Law of the High Seas and the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea generally prohibit interference with foreign merchant ships outside territorial waters unless under very specific exceptions, such as piracy or specific treaty authorizations. Whether the Skipper seizure fully aligns with international legal norms is a subject of controversy. The U.S. government frames it as legitimate enforcement of sanctions tied to national security concerns, while Venezuela and others label it piracy. International legal scholars note the strict limits that customary international law places on high seas interdictions of foreign-flagged vessels without consent, meaning that such actions carry legal risk, absent broad multilateral endorsement. Contrast with blowing boats out of the water, killing everyone on board. In contrast, sinking or destroying a vessel, whether suspected of carrying drugs or linked to criminal networks, is fundamentally different in both legal justification and use of force. Military strikes that destroy vessels are typically justified under military self-defense if there is an imminent threat, domestic counter-drug law enforcement authority, which may empower fatal force in some interdictions, combat operations in active war zones under armed conflict law. For example, in September 2025, U.S. forces struck and sank a speedboat alleged to be carrying narcotics, a strike resulting in fatalities and justified by the administration as counter-narcotics enforcement. That action was a lethal use of force, without boarding or seizure. From a legal standpoint, destroying a vessel carries significantly higher thresholds for justification. It must conform with international humanitarian law if in an armed conflict. It must satisfy use of force law under the UN Charter if involving states. It must respect domestic statutory authority if conducted under law enforcement auspices. Boarding and seizure, by contrast, are non-lethal enforcement actions aimed at taking control and retaining evidence and assets for judicial proceedings. A seizure preserves the vessel and cargo for adjudication, whereas destruction eliminates evidence and forecloses legal adjudication of ownership or criminal liability. Tactical differences. Boarding and seizing a vessel is a meticulous and risk-managed operation focused on minimizing casualties, preserving evidence, assuring control of the vessel, maintaining compliance with domestic and international law. Specialized units like the U.S. Coast Guard's Maritime Security and Response Team and Marine or Navy SEAL teams conduct high seas boardings. These operations often involve helicopters, fast roping, and coordination with multi-agency law enforcement. In contrast, kinetic strikes, whether by aircraft, naval guns, or missiles, prioritize neutralizing the target entirely. These operations are typically faster but risk higher collateral damage. Do not preserve the vessel for legal or evidentiary purposes. Signal a higher level of force that may escalate conflicts. Strategically, seizures limit escalation. They aim to preserve life and property while achieving enforcement goals. Strikes communicate deterrence, but are more likely to provoke retaliation or broader conflict. What will happen to the oil and the vessel? Once a vessel like the Skipper is seized under a warrant, it enters a forfeiture and judicial process. The U.S. government takes custody, relocates the ship to a designated port, and begins formal legal proceedings to confirm its forfeiture. During this process, the cargo, oil in this case, may be held as evidence. The vessel itself may be detained pending adjudication. Parties claiming ownership can contest the forfeiture in court. If a court upholds forfeiture, the U.S. government may take title to the vessel and cargo, potentially selling the oil or using it according to domestic law and sanctions policy. Historically, seized commodities have at times been auctioned and proceeds applied toward enforcement or humanitarian funds, depending on statutory authority and policy decisions. The precise disposition of the Skipper's oil will likely depend on the outcome of the forfeiture process and political considerations. For example, if the cargo is tied to sanctioned networks funding illicit activity, the U.S. may choose to sell the oil on secondary markets under strict controls to ensure proceeds do not return to prohibited entities. Alternatively, domestic use or transfer could support enforcement budgets or allied partners, subject to legal frameworks. The legal process protects third-party interests to the extent that claimants can demonstrate legitimate ownership separate from the alleged offenses. Strategic and policy implications. This episode marks more than an operational moment. It signals a strategic intensification of U.S. pressure on Venezuela's oil economy, with knock-on effects across regional geopolitics. After the seizure, Venezuela's oil exports reportedly declined sharply as shippers avoid sanctioned routes out of fear of further seizures. Reuters. Only a few tankers, such as those linked to major sanctioned-waived entities like Chevron, continue to operate. Cuba denounced the action as a threat to its energy supply and a violation of international law. The U.S. government has also intensified sanctions and deployed additional assets to the Southern Caribbean, augmenting both naval presence and pressure on maritime networks thought to support illicit trade or circumvent sanctions. Wikipedia. These tactics aim to constrict revenue streams that fund the Maduro regime and affiliated networks. However, they also raise complex questions about sovereignty, international legal norms, and the balance of enforcement versus escalation. The boarding and seizure of the skipper marks a critical inflection in maritime enforcement strategy. It underscores the differences between lawful seizure, preserving evidence, assets, and lives, and lethal destruction. Legally, seizing a ship demands judicial authority and stringent procedural conduct. Tactically, it requires precision and coordination. Strategically, it sends a calibrated message without resorting to broader violence. What happens next, in courtrooms, oil markets, and diplomatic arenas, will define not only regional dynamics, but the evolving landscape of maritime law enforcement in an era of sanctions, shadow fleets, and geopolitical competition. This has been Breaking Down the Cartels. Stay tuned for deeper analysis on evolving maritime enforcement and global illicit networks.